Now that you've built your sources, the second step is to build a query. In this tab, you'll see a top left orange button where you can click and label the query that you're going to build. For purposes of this, I'm going to label it a demo test pacing. Once you save that, the next step will allow you to add some inputs. What that means is those sources that you just created, we're now going to pull it into this query, kind of like a pivot table. At a later stage, you can actually pull in an input as another query, but for purposes of this pacing document or pacing query, we'll use a few different sources that I've built from AdWords, Bing, and we'll pull in Facebook. So you'll see I have a filter up here to kind of easily navigate and search for the sources that I've already built. So I have my 4 sources put in on the left side as inputs, and now what I need to do is pull in columns to pull in fields that match up with the respective sources. So the first one that I know all 4 of these sources have are date. I also want to be able to match up my spend across campaigns. And then lastly, I need to pull in my spend. So one more field that would probably help me out would be the source. As you can see, these inputs do have the name as AdWords, Bing, Facebook, but once you build this table, you're only working with these 4 columns. So I need to manually label it as an AdWords source or a Bing or a Facebook. Now this date column, I'm going to select a field that's pre-populated here, and I'm going to look for my day or date. So you'll see the type of this field is a date, and now I need to do the same thing for my Bing or Facebook and Waze. So within Bing, it's titled a little differently. They could call it a time period, but I know using my sources that that's the date field that I'm going to pull in. And then for Facebook, again, similar story here, reporting starts or reporting ends. And lastly, for Waze, nice and simple, date. Going to the campaign, again, a kind of a similar taxonomy here within AdWords. Bing, you're going to have an underscore from the beginning and start. And then for Facebook, I believe it has an underscore in between campaign name. And then lastly, for Waze, I actually don't have a field for campaign. So I'm going to use a static value as a placeholder and just call it Waze. Whenever I'm looking at the campaign for the Waze source, it's just going to be called Waze. And I'm going to label it as a string as the field type to match up with the rest of this column. For spend, this is where we're going to have a few different fields for cost, for example. And then for Bing, we're going to have amount spend here. And then Facebook, we also have a spend. Now you probably are about to notice that there's 2 different field types within this column. I have 2 floats and an integer. And then we'll see what we get for Waze. So it looks like it's a little bit longer of a name, but it lines up to be a float. So what I need to do is actually change my first column to be a float as well. And I can use that by switching the type in this dropdown. Now, Conversionomics is smart enough to actually label all of these together, but what I need to do here is change my type of this column to a float. That way, everything matches up within these columns. Now, for source, there isn't a field that actually pulls that in, so I'm going to use a static value across all 4 of these and label them accordingly. Now that I have this pretty simple query, the first step is to save it and then actually go ahead and run it. Now there's a toggle up here to run dependents. Now that's something that you can turn on at a later point when you have this query set up and you want it to push out to an export. But for purposes of this, I'm just going to go ahead and run this. Depending on the size of your query, how many rows that are involved, the amount of megabytes, this is actually processing data. It may take a few seconds or it may take a few minutes. As a first time, it's still going to compile and start actually building this query. So it might take a little bit longer. I lied, it took about maybe 12 seconds. And so there's a number of options once you have your query saved and run. You can actually filter out a few of these campaigns. You can add some date ranges, but we're going to jump ahead just to the preview to give you a quick look at what is actually being pulled in right now. So you'll see the date that pulls in, they're all in the same format. You have your campaign names, as well as the spend associated with some of these campaigns. Now you'll notice that there is an option to actually filter and sort. You can sort ascending by least amount spent. Some of these may not have spent in a certain day, or by the most. So it looks like we have, millions of dollars being spent on these certain days from an AdWords source. Now, the next part is actually to export this data. Now, there's a couple of options here. You could set up an export to perhaps an external database, such as Google BigQuery, or download a CSV. And once you select that, it starts processing, and then within a few seconds, it'll be available for download and then you can open it within Excel or perhaps Google Docs. And this will actually tell you what's completed, and I'm not sure if it shows up on your screen, but I did just download an Excel CSV of my query. That's a quick overview on how to add a couple of sources and a couple of fields from those inputs and design your first query. Hope this helps. If you have any questions, let us know. In Conversionomics, there's